You- Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Emancipatory Future Studies public talk or lecture by Dr. Daniel Hoyer, Understanding Polycrisis, Definitions, Applications, and Responses. The Emancipatory Future Studies project started off in 2019, and essentially it's all about finding ways forward in the midst of this polycrisis. We work with the research agenda that straddles rethinking temporalities, decolonial futures, futures in history, systemic pathways into the future, grand ecocentric futures, and so on. But our grounding is open to kind of different critical theoretical approaches to understanding that the world we inhabit. And our central sort of premise is this world in polycrisis. So to help us kind of figure out this concept, we have Dr. Daniel Hoyer, and he's a computational historian and complexity scientist. He holds a PhD in classics from New York University, where he studied economic and social development in the High Roman Empire. Since 2014, he has been part of Sheshat, Global History Data Bank, a multidisciplinary project examining long-run social dynamics by combining qualitative and empirical information about the past with advanced quantitative analysis and computer modeling. His current research explores the root causes of and limiting factors to societal development and resilience. In particular, he's interested in understanding societal responses to shifting ecological, social, and economic context that determine well-being outcomes in the past, as well as how this understanding may shed light on critical social pressures today. Dan, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Vish. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, everyone in the room that I can't see, for giving up your Saturday afternoon to listen to me. I do have a few slides to share. Let me start sharing my screen here. Hopefully you can all see this, and this is coming through. Yep, excellent, great. I don't want to spend sort of too much long prattling on. I know you've read the paper, the sort of Understanding Polycrisis paper that we've just submitted. Really just a few kind of points I wanted to emphasize, make sure we're all on the same page, offer a little bit more of the historical perspective, which is really sort of my main thing, flesh it out a little bit more than what was in the paper, but really want to leave a lot of room for discussion and kind of hear your thoughts about polycrisis as a concept. What is its use? What are the limits to sort of applicability moving forward, and sort of have a deep discussion about that. So as I say, and as Vish said, I think very well, really we're taking as our core, as you guys are, as a lot of research and my colleagues are taking as the sort of starting point, we are in a polycrisis, full stop. It's happening, it's happened, we're in the midst of it, it's here, we're living with it. What do we then do about it? So this is our modern age. It is unavoidable, it's happened, we're here. But there are still a few kind of key questions that we're trying to explore and trying to understand, and that was really what drove this Understanding Polycrisis paper that we wrote, which is trying to flesh out some of the details around what exactly does polycrisis mean, in particular in relation to some of these other concepts that have been used in the past, cascading disasters, hazard management, all the different sort of terms and concepts. What is new, what is different, what is relevant about polycrisis compared to some of these other concepts? And of course, one of the things that really strikes me, again, as an historian and taking that sort of deep historical perspective, is you hear in the media, I'm sure you encounter this all the time, oh, we are in unprecedented times. This is unique. This has never happened before. We're facing challenges we've never had to face as a human species before. And then whenever I hear things like that, I'm like, well, is that true? What does that mean exactly? How do we know that? Starting to try to unpack some of that. What is and what isn't precedented in our current age, and I'll try to explore some of these things and give some examples from history about what I'm talking about. And finally, the most important question, of course, is, well, once we wrap our heads, or at least start to wrap our heads around this concept and what it means, then the real question is, how does this concept actually help us address our current pressing challenges? How does this term, this very academic, theoretical kind of idea actually help us manage and navigate our world in the present. And so we'll talk about that, and that's where I want to kind of leave off and hope to stimulate some discussion and get your thoughts around all that as well. So of course, when we're talking about polycrisis, at the heart of it is crisis. So what does crisis mean? Again, I know you've read the paper. I don't want to dwell on these sort of definitions, but there's a few things that I think are worth stressing here, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I mean, the main thing about crisis is that really at its heart, it's about risk. High risk, growing risk, right? When risk becomes acute, when the probability that the risk of something bad happening is really high, that it will actually, in fact, turn into something bad, as that probability, as that chance, as the prospects of some negative outcome grow, that's when a system is said to be in crisis, right? Crisis, essentially, it requires a response. It requires action and intervention. Otherwise, something bad is going to happen. In this sort of field, in climate science and biophysics and biochemistry, they tend to define risk as the sort of sum, or not the sum, the product of different causal factors, like the different stresses, the exposure of the system to the thing, to these causal factors, and its vulnerability to those causal factors, which are a little bit different, right? You can be exposed to something, right? A building is exposed to high winds, but it's not very vulnerable to it, so the risk is generally low. Causal factors, and this is a key important point, it's both the very long-term stresses and pressures that can build up and linger over decades, even centuries, as well as the triggers, right? The sort of constrained event. These are the major things that people tend to focus on, are these triggers. So a hurricane, a flood, an earthquake, an assassination. These are triggering events, but it's always how they interact with the longer term pressures that determine exactly what the risk is. And so a very simple example of this is, again, a bridge, right? A bridge is a very constrained, simple kind of system, made of metal and wire and concrete that performs a very specific function to provide, passage over a river, let's say. So that bridge can be at crisis, right? If there's a hurricane on the horizon, or a hurricane is predicted, that's a causal factor. Maybe there's long-term pressures, maybe there's wear and tear, maybe the concrete is starting to crack. Those are long-term stresses. If the bridge is exposed to the high winds of that hurricane and it is vulnerable to it, then it's at high risk. There's a chance that the bridge will collapse facing this pressure, right? It is at risk. That's a very simple, kind of intuitive way to understand it. But what this actually means in practice, if you think about it, is that risk then presents, or crisis then presents, as a spectrum. And this is something we tried to bring out in the paper, and I want to really stress it because I think it's an important point and got buried a little bit just in the narrative flow. But really, this is not the usual way people think or talk about crises, but I think this is an important reframing. If you think about it as a spectrum, it goes from very localized, very constrained kind of crises. A single system, a single aspect of a system is involved, right? Again, think of this bridge in a village. It can be under crisis. It can be facing a high prospect of collapse. If that happens, that would be maybe devastating for that community, right? It is an important event, but it's unlikely to spread to other areas, to other communities. It's unlikely to affect other kinds of systems. It's just a single bridge that collapses. On the other end, we have modern polycrisis. This is sort of the extreme other end of the crisis spectrum, where it's multiple systems, it's pan-regional, potentially global. It's all the things we're going to be talking about that characterize our modern crisis. So the reason this is important is because, in my mind, is it gets us past thinking about, oh, is this a polycrisis or not? Where's the line? Where's the threshold, right? We stop asking those kinds of definitional questions, what is and isn't a polycrisis. That doesn't matter so much, right? What matters is, where on the spectrum are we? Because if it's a spectrum, it means that the entire range can be filled in. You can have crises that are closer to the localized and constrained version. Maybe they're localized, but it is multiple different systems involved. Think of a housing crisis in a particular community. Maybe it only affects that community, but it affects housing, it affects well-being, it affects economics. There's multiple different systems involved. So it's not quite at the far end of the extreme, but it's still far away from a modern polycrisis. And then you can have things that are pretty close. Maybe they don't have every aspect of our modern polycrisis, or not a manifestation of it, but they can be multi-systemic, they can be interregional. As I'll argue, many periods in the past, in my mind, are not quite the level of our modern age of polycrisis, but they come pretty damn close. And then there's reasons that that is important, and I'll try to spell those out. But this is why I want to stress that thinking of crisis as a spectrum can help us get past some of what I think are, or at least what I identify as some definitional issues that seem to hold up progress in thinking about and addressing some of these problems. But again, we can talk about that sort of at the end. So with that all in mind, this is where we came up with our definition. This is just taken from this paper. I'm not going to read this. But this is where we get that, okay, well, if we're thinking about what is the extreme end of the crisis spectrum, it's the fact that it's a state, right? Polycrisis is never any single event, never any single crisis. It's the state of the world that puts many different systems at high and growing risk. And that risk is manifested globally. The other thing to stress, and this is what our colleagues at the Cascade Institute really want to get across, is it's not only that there's risk in many different systems at once, but those systems themselves are causally entangled, which means that if something bad happens in one system, there's a very, very high probability that it will lead to bad things happening in other systems. And that feedback loop can kind of close itself off, and you get this sort of negative feedback loop and this vicious cycle that can just spiral and spiral and spiral. So climate stress leading to ecological disaster, leading to economic disaster, leading to food shock, leading to well-being shocks, leading to social unrest and political violence. All of these things can sort of cycle through each other because our systems are so causally entangled. And these are the features that characterize our modern polycrisis more than anything. This is what we're trying to get across. And again, it's easy to get hung up on a definition of, was COVID part of the polycrisis? Is the Russia invasion of Ukraine part of the polycrisis? We can debate, that definitional issue, but ultimately what matters are where on that spectrum of crises different events hit. And the key features are these sorts of things, right? What are the embeddedness, the ecological embeddedness? What is the causal entanglement across systems? What is the geographical scope of these crises and how they're playing out? These are the sort of features to keep in mind when we're thinking about and trying to identify what exactly the polycrisis is and how it manifests. The other sort of key thing to bring across, and one of the sort of differences, and I'll get to this in a second, but one of the things that sets our modern polycrisis apart from maybe other periods in the past is that the climate stress, again, this long-term, large-scale climate stress is anthropogenic. And it's not going away, right? It's here, it's happened, we've done this, the planet has changed, is changing, and it's more or less permanent, which means that we are in a state of permacrisis, and people have started to use this word as well in addition to polycrisis. Think about it, right? One of the key things about crisis is the long-term stresses that create risk. If those stresses are being produced by a changing and warming climate, and that climate stress is not going to go away, there's no prospect of decreasing, then that means that stress and that risk will be here forever. This is just the world we are now facing. That's really heavy. I'll let that sink in for a second. We can sort of try to unpack that in a bit, but this is why going through this sort of exercise of trying to understand what polycrisis means can be really important, right? It helps us realize the sort of scope of the challenges we're facing. The other thing to sort of keep in mind, again, is that we are not thinking about a single crisis, a single triggering event, a single disaster. These are repeated and recurrent events, right? We're thinking about the full timeline. We have to extend our temporal scope. So we're thinking about crises that are repeated. They are maybe cascading. Again, they're feeding back on each other because our systems are causally entangled with each other. And each sort of actual disaster that's realized can dwindle our capacity. And if the next triggering event happens too soon after the last one, we don't have a chance to rebuild our capacity. So then we're in a worse position to face the second triggering event compared to the first, and then the third and the fourth, and so on and so on. And that's what this graph, which again is taken from the paper, is really trying to bring out. This is a deceptively simple looking graph, but there's actually a lot of information, and important information, I would say, in here. So this is the sort of normal way that disaster management, crisis management science has treated these issues, this graph on the left. The idea that, okay, your state capacity, your cohesion, your economic, whatever you want to define as capacity, right? Your ability to manage and recover from a triggering event. That's basically what capacity is. The assumption is, okay, well, it's just humming along. There will be some trigger event, some bad thing will happen that will create, negative well-being, and it'll diminish your capacity in the short term, but you will then recover and everything will be fine. But on the right, this is more the state of polycrisis that we're living in now, where capacity is being drained, even without the trigger, right? It's just this long-term, lingering perma stress that has existed mostly from environmental and ecological stress, but other stresses as well, social stress, inequality, sort of political dysfunction. These are all stresses that linger. They diminish your capacity over time, so that when the triggering event happens, you're already in a worse position to face it. Then you get the sort of dip, the normal kind of dip from the trigger. You can recover a little bit, but again, you're unlikely to reach the level of capacity you were before. And if you don't deal with the underlying stresses, you're going to continue to decline. And then if another trigger hits, you're in an even worse position. And this is one of the key, I think, ideas and things to bring about, and helps to explain what our modern polycrisis is and what we're facing. Because again, you can't treat them as separate and discrete events. So this is kind of the key point I wanted to emphasize about how we understand what polycrisis is. Then we turn to the question, and again, as an historian, I always come back to, well, is it really unique? And if it's not, if there are at least some aspects of past moments that resemble polycrisis in some ways, well, what does that mean? What does that matter? What do we do with that? So let me give you a little overview of how I see these answer this question. There are absolutely certain features, I would argue, that are new and unique and novel about our modern polycrisis, right? The way that our world is interconnected truly globally, this has not been seen in the past. This is not in the pre-industrial world. There have been large regional connections, but never as truly global as we face today, which means that the global scale and the synchrony of shocks is much quicker, it's much more immediate, it's much more extensive than it ever has been in the past. Our systems are more deeply entangled than they have been in the past. And again, as I said, the fact that anthropogenic climate change is permanent and irrecoverable, that is new. That is a post-industrial feature that we have not faced before. However, there are many, many, many aspects that characterize our modern polycrisis that I would argue are very familiar from the past and have been faced and overcome more or less successfully by human societies in the past. When we talk about things like wars that are macro-regional, the economic turmoil and how shocks can reverberate across regions and through different societies, those have absolutely happened in the past. Our systems have been constantly entangled in the past, just not quite as deeply as today, but certainly to a large extent. The inequality that we see today has absolutely happened in the past. Factionalism, xenophobia, nationalist movements, all of these are very common. And even actually the environmental stress, and I think people don't realize this enough. The environmental stress that we're facing today, the ecological disasters, famine, droughts, pandemics, certainly, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, even climate change, right? Fluctuating, unstable, unfavorable climate regimes have absolutely been common in the past. The difference is that in our modern age, it's anthropogenic. In the past, it has been sort of more truly exogenous causes, which means that even though these bad, unstable climate regimes have occurred and they've lasted a long time, they eventually went away and it came back to the sort of stable median, whereas we're facing a prospect where that's not possible anymore. That's the difference, in my mind at least. So really what my conclusion is, and I've argued this in print a little bit, is that there are, in fact, and have been polycrises of the past, at least maybe not quite as far on the spectrum as our modern polycrisis, but pretty damn close. The sad reality of this is that, you know, a lot of times, and what history is sort of riddled with, are examples of societies that succumbed to these crises and to these pressures. And the sad reality is that every society that has ever existed has, one way or another, ceased to exist, or is changed sort of unrecognizably. And the only difference is, or the only exception, are the societies we inhabit today. But the question is, have we somehow magically managed to uncover the secret of immortal institutions? Or is it just that we haven't collapsed yet? And so this is the sort of grim reality that we find when we explore the past and we see how devastating these polycrises of the past have been. There is some optimism that I'll pull out in the end, but we'll get there in a bit. I just want to let us sort of sit with this reality for a moment. Just a little bit of a plug is the reason we know this, right? This isn't just speculation. This is sort of what me and my colleagues are doing with the Seshat Databank, trying to gather as much information about the past as possible to really explore how these dynamics play out. And also this sort of new organization that we're putting together, which is called Societal Dynamics, or SODI, where we're trying to give a platform to take this understanding, take this sort of scientific analysis of historical information and apply it to the modern age and say, are there lessons, are there sort of interventions or mechanisms that we can adapt from the past for today? And again, I'll come back to that in the end. Just want to sort of walk through one example of a period in the past that I think comes pretty close to a polycrisis. This is the Little Ice Age, the so-called Little Ice Age. Again, this is a long, long period, late 14th through early 19th century, very, very poor, highly variable climate regime across Eurasia. So this is Europe, North Africa, sort of into northern sub-Saharan Africa, all the way into South and East Asia. Cold spells, dry, lots of bad stuff was going on. And so, you know, if you focus, for example, on Egypt during this period, especially in the kind of 15th and 16th centuries, it really exemplifies, I think, a lot of what we're facing today. And I think a lot of these sort of crises that they were experiencing are going to sound very familiar to us all from today. So as I say, in this period, in this Little Ice Age, there was this poor, unfavorable climate regime that lasted sort of 4 centuries, extended throughout Afro-Eurasia. This then led to very much the same kind of ecological disasters that we're facing. There was droughts, there was flooding, there was major famines, there was locust swarms. There were really bad periods of locust swarms, especially in East and Southeast Asia at different periods. Again, the climate was just unfavorable. It was unpredictable. This led to very acute ecological triggers, very much the way we're seeing today. At the same time, and again, I think this is underappreciated, this world in the sort of high to late medieval period, especially across Europe and Asia, was very, very interconnected. There was trade, there was exchange, there was deep entanglement of systems. Different societies relied on this exchange for food security, just like we have today. And therefore, when these food systems and exchange systems were disrupted, it led to very acute famines. It led to sort of horrible shocks to well-being, again, just like today. It's not a coincidence that it's in this very same period and with all of these entanglements and climate environmental stress, this is the period when the bubonic plague was raging, right? This is the period, the age of the Black Death. That's not a coincidence. That was ravaging societies across, again, all of these large regions, this major pandemic. At the same time, these stresses, these disruptions in trade, this sort of shocks to well-being, as you would expect, led to hostility. This led to warfare, both between societies and a lot of internal rebellion, civil war, things like that. For example, there was some major civil wars in the 15th and 16th century in some of the khanates that were in sort of northern and eastern Asia, which again disrupted food supplies. So this is why Egypt in this period, like late 15th century, was facing all of these things at once. It was facing a major famine because the Nile flooding was a little too big for a few years, ruined a bunch of crops. They relied on trade from these sort of Northern Asian societies that was disrupted when they were at warfare. Egypt was ruled by the Mamluks at the time. The Mamluks sort of cracked down when this famine was happening, when there was unrest in Egypt, instead of sort of spending money to rebuild infrastructure or to try to support well-being or get food in for the country that was starving, they kind of cracked down and were really oppressive about quelling unrest. This then led to a major civil war. The Mamluk Sultan was assassinated in Egypt. This was this huge, major period. It's called the Great Mamluk Crisis. Again, all of these things are happening. It's very, very familiar to this polycrisis kind of world that we're facing today. What's interesting is that, other societies that are facing a lot of these same pressures at the same time had some different responses to it, right? Not everyone descended into civil war and chaos. For example, in Northern Europe, there's certain countries that sort of the state and the elites, instead of kind of cracking down on dissent, they supported institutional reform, they supported economic reform. There were some concessions to labor. There was sort of the abolition of serfdom in certain societies. There were some positive reforms that came out of this. Some people have argued that this actually led to or helps explain why it was Northern Europe that led the way in the Industrial Revolution. They had managed to create some kind of positive institutional reinforcements. Again, a sort of different response to these same polycrisis pressures. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. But this, to my mind, is a good example of what I mean when I say there have been polycrisis or something similar in the past. So given that, right, so if we accept that that's true, how does that help? Whether it's a polycrisis in the past or just fleshing out what we think polycrisis as a concept means. I'm going to leave you with these thoughts. So I think there's sort of two key areas that the idea of polycrisis really helps us get our heads around, that other terms, other concepts just don't quite get at. The first is exposing the complexity and the entanglements, right? It's that it's not just a single crisis in a single system. It's not just a single area that's affected. We have to understand all of the feedback and interaction and interrelationships between all of these different systems that are each facing their own kinds of crisis. What this means and why this is important is because it means that mono solutions won't work because we are facing polycrises, right? So politicians tend to want to focus on one problem at a time. Oh, let's solve, we're facing inflationary pressures, let's solve that. Oh, we're facing sort of civil unrest, let's solve that. That's misguided because those crises, those pressures themselves are not discrete. And so solutions that only target one and don't consider the interactions among other systems are kind of doomed to fail or to lead to sort of negative side effects. And this may mean that we need to rethink and unthink some of our current systems if they are presenting persistent crises or are producing harmful results, right? So people talk about, if our sort of modern capitalist economic system, if it itself is the cause of crisis, is the cause of suppressed well-being across other systems, then we may need to rethink that system, right? It itself is a dysfunctional system within this complex web of systems. So this is why people promote things like the well-being economy, right? Just a different reframing and rethinking of what our economic systems ought to be, given how they impact other systems and health, biological well-being, the well-being of non-human habitats and systems. All of these things are affected, so we need to understand and take into consideration all of those outcomes when we're trying to think about what kind of systems do we want. The other reason I think this helps, and this comes again back to why I think the historical perspective is important, is given, and if you accept that, there are periods in the past that come pretty close to polycrisis. This means that there may be some relevant lessons from our past experience with these different aspects of polycrisis that I've spelled out. We can identify maladaptive responses, right? As I said, history is littered with very poor responses to crisis. That's scary, but it can also be really helpful. It can be hopeful. It can be informative to see what people did wrong, right? Again, you talk about the response of the Mamluk rulers in Egypt in the 15th century. They see unrest. They crack down. They want to restore order. They want to preserve the status quo. They're not willing to accept change in their fundamental economic and social systems. And that backfired, right? Led to this huge violent civil war that was terrible for everybody. That's a maladaptive response. You can see that kind of response. It's very common. You can see that happening today in different societies, right? This response to closing down, trying to preserve, hold on to the status quo, populist, nationalist kind of fervor. This is a very common response throughout history. And what we find is it almost never ends well. The other kinds of response where you are willing to accept some change, you initiate and support reforms that decrease inequality, let's say, that improve the well-being of most people, that can get rid of some of those stresses that make it harder to respond to triggering events. Those are more positive responses that we see rarely, but we do find them in history, and they tend to then create more resilient, more sustainable, more high well-being achieving societies in the long run. And so being able to identify those factors that can boost positive resilience and reform and adaptation are very key. And again, it's sort of, changing the status quo from one of structural inequality, from differences and divisions between different groups, both humans and non-humans, to one of cooperation and cohesion. And I like this little chart because this is sort of, in my mind, a great visualization for what we're actually trying to get at, which is strong social cohesion so that we are all working together to tackle the major big fish problems, whether that's climate change, whether that's ecological stress, whether that's economic dysfunction, capitalism that is not serving our interests, whether that's civil unrest and civil discord, whatever it happens to be. We can't tackle these major problems alone, just like we can't tackle one system at a time. We have to work together to solve these complex, interrelated, connected problems. That's really all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for listening. Really, as I say, interested in hearing your thoughts on especially how you think polycrisis might be able to actually help us navigate our current issues and stresses, and how maybe you think they don't. So very interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for listening. Vish, thank you. Let me stop sharing so I can see